I moved into my apartment in Chicago in the fall of 2022. It wasn't a great apartment, but it was cheap, and at the time, that was basically all I cared about. It was an old 3-story building with 4 apartments on each floor. My apartment was on the 2nd floor. The building itself was pretty quiet. I could hear the occasional door closing or somebody walking down the hallway, but nothing unusual. The apartment directly above mine was different though. It had apparently been empty for several months before I moved in. The landlord mentioned that when I was signing the lease, he actually pointed up at the ceiling and said, "Nobody's living up there right now, so don't worry if you hear the pipes or anything." I didn't think much of it. Old apartment buildings make noises. That's normal. First time I heard the footsteps was probably about a week after I moved in. It was around 1:30 in the morning. I was lying in bed watching something on my phone when I heard 3 footsteps above me. Just 3. Then nothing. I took my headphones off and listened. Nothing. A few seconds later, I heard another set of footsteps. This time, they sounded like someone was walking slowly across the room. I actually smiled because I remembered what the landlord had said. Old pipes, old floors, whatever. I put my headphones back on. About 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time, it sounded like someone walking from one end of the apartment to the other. I could even hear a slight creaking sound with each step. I remember thinking that whoever lived above me was probably getting home late. I didn't know the apartment was supposed to be empty. The next morning, I texted my landlord. I asked him if someone had moved into the apartment above me. He replied almost immediately, "No, still vacant." I thought maybe he was wrong. So that evening, when I got home from work, I went upstairs. The hallway was completely empty. I stood outside the apartment above mine. There was a lock on the door, and there was even a little piece of paper taped across the frame. It was obvious nobody had been going in and out. I put my ear against the door. Nothing. I knocked once. No response. I felt pretty stupid standing there, so I went back downstairs. That night, around midnight, I heard it again. This time there were more footsteps. They started directly above my bedroom. Then they moved toward the hallway. Then back again. It sounded like somebody was pacing. Back and forth. For almost 20 minutes. I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next few nights, the footsteps became a routine. Usually between midnight and 3 a.m. Sometimes they were slow. Sometimes they sounded like someone walking quickly. Once, I heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. That one actually scared me. I called the landlord again. This time I asked him to come over. He came the next afternoon. We walked upstairs together. He unlocked the apartment. The place was completely empty. No furniture, no boxes, nothing. Just dusty floors and bare walls. I remember standing in the middle of the living room feeling really stupid. The landlord looked at me and said, "See? Nothing up here." I asked him if maybe somebody had another key. He said there was only one key for the apartment. His. He locked the door again. I went downstairs feeling relieved. For the first time, I thought maybe I'd imagined everything. That night at exactly 2:17 a.m. I woke up. I didn't know what had woken me. Then I heard something directly above my bed. A single footstep. I opened my eyes. Another one. Then another. Slowly. It sounded like someone was standing directly above me. I stared at the ceiling. I could actually hear the floorboards creaking. Then the footsteps moved. One step toward the hallway. Then another. Then another. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 2:90. I remember thinking, there's no way. I got out of bed and walked into the hallway. The footsteps continued above me. I followed them. They moved from the bedroom toward what I assumed was the living room upstairs. Then they stopped. Completely. I stood there listening. Nothing. Then 3 knocks came from directly above my head. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. I just stood there staring at the ceiling. The next morning, I called the landlord again. I told him exactly what happened. This time he didn't laugh. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Are you sure you're hearing it from above?" I said yes. He told me to wait for him. He showed up about an hour later. We went upstairs again. He unlocked the apartment. Same thing. Completely empty. But this time he checked every room. He checked the closets, the bathroom, the kitchen, everything. Nothing. Then he opened a small door near the back of the apartment. Behind it was a narrow maintenance space between the walls. I had never noticed it before. The landlord shined his flashlight inside. It was completely dark. He said the space connected to some of the plumbing and electrical wiring. I asked him if somebody could get inside from there. He said, "Not without tearing half the wall apart." We closed it. I felt a little better. At least there was an explanation for the noises. Maybe pipes. Maybe the building settling. Maybe something else. I went back downstairs. That night I heard the footsteps again. Except this time, they weren't above me. They were coming from inside my apartment. I heard one step in the hallway. I froze. Then another. It sounded like someone was slowly walking toward my bedroom. I checked the front door. Locked. I checked the windows. Locked. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find. I know that sounds dramatic, but I didn't know what else to do. I stood in my bedroom with the lights off. The footsteps stopped outside my door. For maybe 10 seconds, there was complete silence. Then I heard the floor creak. Not above me, not downstairs, right outside my bedroom. I called the police. While I was talking to the dispatcher, I heard something scrape against the wall. Then silence. The police arrived a few minutes later. They searched my entire apartment. Nobody was there. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing looked disturbed. The officers checked the hallway and even went upstairs. The apartment above mine was still empty. One officer actually joked that maybe I had a ghost. I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. But after they left, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I started looking for another apartment. I was done. But before I left, I wanted to figure out what was happening. I asked the landlord if he had ever heard strange noises from that apartment before. He hesitated. Then he told me something he hadn't mentioned before. The apartment had been empty for almost 8 months. But apparently, the previous tenant had complained about hearing footsteps too. I asked him why he hadn't told me that. He said he didn't think it was important. The previous tenant had eventually moved out. No explanation. Just left. That really bothered me. So, I asked him to show me the old maintenance records. He didn't want to at first. Eventually, he gave me a folder. There wasn't much, but one note caught my attention. It was from a maintenance worker. It said there was possible movement in the wall cavity near the bedroom. That was all. No explanation. No follow-up. Just that sentence. I looked at the landlord. He said he had assumed it was mice. That night was my last night in the apartment. I packed most of my things and decided to sleep at a friend's place. Before leaving, I went upstairs one last time. The hallway was completely silent. I stood outside the empty apartment. The door was locked. I put my ear against it. Nothing. I was about to walk away when I heard something. Very faint. A footstep. Inside, I stepped back. Then another. I swear I heard someone walking across the empty apartment. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The footsteps continued, slowly moving toward the front door. I watched the doorknob. It didn't move. The footsteps stopped directly on the other side. Then came 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Exactly the same as before. I didn't open the door. I just backed away. After about 30 seconds, I heard another sound. A long scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Then everything went silent. I went downstairs. I grabbed my bags, and I left. I never went back to that apartment. A few weeks later, I contacted the landlord to ask if he had rented it out. He said no. Apparently the apartment was still empty. I asked him if anyone had ever figured out what caused the noises. He said they had checked the pipes. They checked the walls. They checked the attic. Nothing. He eventually stopped responding to my messages. I moved to another part of the city and forgot about the whole thing. Or at least I tried to. About a year later, I was cleaning out an old box and found the video I had recorded that final night. I had completely forgotten about it. I played it. At first, all I could hear was the footsteps, then the 3 knocks. But underneath the knocks, there was another sound, very quiet, almost impossible to hear. I turned the volume all the way up, and I heard a voice. It sounded like a man whispering. I couldn't make out everything he said, but there were 3 words I could understand. "You're downstairs now." I haven't listened to that recording since. This happened a few years ago when I was living in Seattle. I was working at a restaurant downtown, and every once in a while I'd have to close. Usually I'd finish around 11:30 at night. Most nights I'd take the bus home. It wasn't a big deal. The bus stop was only a few minutes from the restaurant, and the ride itself took maybe 40 minutes. But one night I got stuck closing late. By the time I finally left the restaurant, it was almost 1 a.m. The streets were mostly empty. It was raining lightly, and I remember thinking that I really should have just called an Uber. But I didn't want to spend the money, so I walked to the bus stop and waited. The bus arrived about 10 minutes later. It was an older city bus. I got on, tapped my card, and immediately noticed there was almost nobody inside. There were maybe 4 passengers. 2 people sitting near the front, someone asleep near the middle, and an older man sitting all the way in the back. I sat on the opposite side of the aisle. The driver didn't say anything. He just closed the doors and pulled away. I put my headphones on and looked out the window. For the first 20 minutes, everything was normal. We stopped at a few regular bus stops. People got off. Eventually, I realized I was the only passenger left besides the man in the back. I didn't think much of it. It was late. People get off buses. That's normal. Then we passed my usual stop. I noticed it almost immediately. We weren't going toward my neighborhood anymore. At first, I thought the driver had taken a detour. Maybe there was construction. Maybe there had been an accident. So I didn't worry. But then the bus turned onto a road I had never seen before. I took my headphones off. I looked at the route number above the driver. Same bus, same route. I checked my phone. The GPS showed that we were moving farther away from my apartment. I stood up and walked toward the front. I asked the driver if the route had changed. He didn't answer. I thought maybe he couldn't hear me, so I asked again. This time he looked at me through the mirror. He didn't say anything. He just pointed toward a seat. Then he kept driving. I went back to my seat. That's when I noticed the older man in the back. He was staring at me, and he looked scared. I looked back at him. He immediately looked away. A few minutes later, the bus stopped. There wasn't a bus stop. There wasn't a building. There wasn't even a sidewalk. Just a narrow road surrounded by trees. The doors opened. Nobody got on. Nobody got off. The driver just sat there for almost 30 seconds. Then he closed the doors and started driving again. I started feeling uncomfortable. I checked my phone. No service. That was strange because I'd had full signal earlier. I tried calling my friend. The call wouldn't go through. Then the bus stopped again. Same thing. Empty road. Doors opened. Nobody there. Then it happened a third time. At this point, I knew something wasn't right. I got up and walked toward the driver again. This time, I asked him directly, "Where are we going?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring straight ahead. I went back to my seat. The older man in the back suddenly leaned forward. He whispered something. I couldn't hear him. I walked closer. He whispered again. This time I heard him. "Don't get off." I asked him why. He looked toward the driver, then back at me. He said he doesn't usually stop here. I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the window. I followed his eyes. There was nothing outside, just trees. Then the bus stopped again. The doors opened. The older man grabbed my arm. "Don't." I pulled away. I was honestly getting angry at this point. I wanted to get off the bus. I wanted to call someone. Anything. But the moment I stood up, the driver slammed the door shut. Then he accelerated, really fast. The older man just sat there staring at the floor. A few minutes later, I noticed something outside. There was a small building in the distance. It looked like an old gas station. We drove past it. Then maybe 2 minutes later, we passed it again. I knew we had passed it already. Same broken sign. Same abandoned pumps. Same white building. I looked at the older man. He was staring at me. He said quietly, "Don't look outside." I asked him why. He didn't answer. The bus turned around, and we passed the gas station again. Same building, same sign, same broken window. I started feeling sick. I opened my phone. Still no service. Then I tried the emergency call screen. Nothing. The driver suddenly spoke. It was the first thing he'd said all night. He said, "Almost home." But I knew we weren't anywhere near my home. The older man suddenly stood up. He walked toward the front. The driver stopped the bus. The man opened the rear door himself. Then he jumped off. I watched him disappear into the darkness. The driver didn't react. He just closed the doors. I was now completely alone with him. I walked toward the front. I told him I wanted to get off. He ignored me. I told him again. Nothing. Then I noticed something. There was no route map. No bus schedule. No advertisements. Nothing. The bus looked normal from the outside. But inside, it was almost completely empty. I looked at the driver's mirror. I could see his face. He was smiling. Not a big smile. Just this tiny smile. Like he knew something I didn't. Then the bus stopped. The doors opened, and I saw my apartment building outside. I stood there completely frozen. It was my street. My building. Everything looked exactly right. I almost got off. Then I noticed something. Every window in my apartment building was dark. Every single one. Even the street lights were off. I looked at my phone. The time said 2:17 a.m. I had been on the bus for almost an hour, but according to my phone's last GPS location, I was still downtown. I looked back outside. The building was gone. It was just another empty road. Trees, rain, nothing else. I turned toward the driver. He was staring straight ahead again. I asked him what was happening. He didn't answer. Then I heard the rear doors open. I looked back. Nobody was there, but I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Slowly, one step at a time. I backed away. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't see anyone. Then the driver suddenly slammed on the brakes. The bus stopped. The doors opened. This time I didn't think. I ran. I jumped off the bus and started running down the road. I didn't know where I was. I didn't care. I just ran. After maybe 5 minutes, I saw headlights. A car was coming toward me. I waved my arms. The car stopped. A woman was driving. She asked if I needed help. I told her about the bus. She looked confused. She said there hadn't been a bus on that road in years. I thought she was joking. She wasn't. She drove me to the nearest town. I called the bus company. I gave them the route number. They told me the last bus on that route had ended service hours earlier. There shouldn't have been a bus running at 1 a.m., and the route I had been on didn't even go through that forest. I never found out what that bus was. The bus company checked their records. Nothing. There was no driver matching the description. No bus with that route number operating that late. And the weirdest part? A few days later, I went back to the area with my friend during the day. We found the road. We found the abandoned gas station. But there was no bus stop, no road sign, nothing. The older man was never found either. I still take buses sometimes, but I don't take them late at night anymore. And whenever I'm on one and the driver suddenly turns onto a road I don't recognize, I get off. I don't care where. I don't care how far I have to walk, because I still remember the last thing that driver said to me. Almost home. And the strange thing is, I don't think he was talking about my home. This started happening about 2 years ago when I was living alone in an apartment building in Portland. It was an older building, probably built sometime in the 70s. Nothing fancy, but it was in a decent neighborhood. The rent was reasonable, and I never really had any problems there. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, near the end of the hallway. There were only 6 apartments on my floor, so it was usually pretty quiet. I worked normal hours and usually came home around 6 in the evening. Every night I had the same routine. I'd unlock my apartment, walk inside, lock the door behind me, and then usually spend the rest of the night watching TV or playing games. I was pretty careful about locking my door. Maybe a little too careful. I always checked the handle after locking it. So, when I woke up one morning and found my apartment door slightly open, I immediately knew something was wrong. At first I thought maybe I had forgotten to lock it. I was still half asleep, so I couldn't completely rule that out. I got out of bed and walked toward the door. Nothing looked disturbed. My laptop was still on the desk. My wallet was where I left it. My keys were on the kitchen counter. Nothing was missing. I checked the lock. It wasn't broken. There were no scratches around it. The door had simply been left open about 3 inches. I closed it and locked it again. Then I stood there for a minute trying to remember the night before. I could clearly remember coming home. I remembered locking the door. I even remembered pulling on the handle to make sure it was locked. But I figured I must have been tired, so I went to work. I didn't think about it again until the next morning, when I found the door open again. This time I knew I hadn't forgotten. I had actually taken a picture of the locked door before going to sleep. It was something I did because I had been having trouble sleeping and was trying to make sure I wasn't constantly getting up to check things. The picture showed the door completely closed. The deadbolt was locked. I had gone to bed around midnight. At 7:10 the next morning it was open again. I called my landlord. I told him what was happening. He came over that afternoon and inspected the door. He said the lock was working perfectly. He even replaced the deadbolt just to be safe. I asked if there was any way someone could unlock it from outside. He said no, not without a key. I asked if anyone else had a key. He said the maintenance company had a master key, but nobody had entered my apartment. I believed him. At least I wanted to. That night I decided to test it. Before going to bed, I checked every window. I locked the front door. Then I put a small piece of clear tape across the inside edge of the door. If the door opened, the tape would break. I went to sleep. At around 3 in the morning, I woke up for no particular reason. The apartment was completely silent. I checked the time. 3:14 a.m. I didn't hear anything. I went back to sleep. When I woke up again, it was 7 a.m. The tape was still there. For a second I felt relieved. Then I looked at the door. It was open. The tape was still attached. It hadn't broken. I walked over slowly. The door was open maybe 4 inches. The deadbolt was still locked. I couldn't understand how it had happened. I checked the tape again. It hadn't moved. Someone or something had opened the door from inside the apartment. At least that's what it looked like. I started getting paranoid. I checked the entire apartment. Closets, bathroom, under the bed, behind the shower curtain, nothing. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. I called my landlord again. He came over and checked everything. He looked genuinely confused. Then he asked me something. He said, "Do you hear anything at night?" I told him no. Not usually. He thought for a moment and said there had been another tenant on the second floor who had complained about hearing footsteps in the hallway. That didn't make me feel any better. I bought a cheap security camera and pointed it directly at my front door. That night I went to sleep. The next morning I checked the recording. For almost 7 hours nothing happened. The hallway stayed completely empty. Then at 3:12 a.m. the camera suddenly stopped recording, only for about 11 seconds. When it came back, my door was open. There was no footage of it opening. I thought maybe the camera was defective, so I bought another one. This time, I put one inside the apartment facing the door. I also bought a motion sensor. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on my couch with all the lights off and watched the camera. Nothing happened. Around 2 a.m. I finally started feeling stupid. I was exhausted. I went to bed. The next morning the motion sensor showed something strange. It had detected movement at 3:12 a.m. Exactly the same time the first camera had stopped recording. I opened the footage. For about 11 seconds the video was completely black. Then it came back. The apartment door was open. But this time there was something else. The hallway light outside my apartment had turned on. The motion sensor in my apartment had triggered. Something had apparently moved inside my apartment. But there was no one on the video. I watched it over and over. Nothing. Just an empty hallway. An open door. And 11 missing seconds. I called the police. They came over and looked at the footage. They couldn't explain it either. One officer suggested the door might not be closing properly. So he tested it. He slammed it shut. Locked it. Pulled on it. It didn't move. He tried again. Nothing. He told me there was no obvious way someone could open it from the hallway. Then he noticed something. There was a small gap underneath my door. He got down and looked through it. The hallway was empty, but he asked me something I'll never forget. "Does anyone live directly across from you?" I said no. That apartment had been empty for months. He looked toward the hallway. Then he said, "Because somebody has been standing here." I asked him what he meant. He pointed at the carpet. There were dark, slightly wet marks directly outside my door, like someone had been standing there in wet shoes. I hadn't noticed them before. The police checked the hallway. They checked the stairs. They checked the elevator. Nothing. The wet marks eventually disappeared near the stairwell. The officer told me to stay somewhere else for the night. I did. I stayed at a friend's apartment. The next morning, I went back to get some clothes. My door was locked. Everything looked normal. I started packing. Then I noticed something on the inside of my front door. There were 3 tiny scratches near the handle. They hadn't been there before. I took a picture. I called my landlord. He told me to leave the apartment. I didn't argue. I packed what I could and left. For the next few weeks, I stayed with friends while looking for another place. Eventually, I found one. I moved out completely. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. About 3 months later, my old landlord called me. He said the apartment had been rented again. I didn't really care. Then he said something strange. The new tenant had complained about the door. Apparently every morning they were finding it slightly open. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He said the new tenant had also installed a camera. I asked if the footage showed anything. He said no. The camera would record normally all night. Then at exactly 3:12 a.m., there would be 11 seconds missing every single night. I asked him if he had checked the apartment. He said yes. Nothing? No broken locks. No open windows. No signs of anyone entering. Then he told me something else. The new tenant had moved out after only 12 days. I asked him why. He said the tenant left the keys on the kitchen counter. They didn't leave a note. They just moved out. I haven't been back to that building since. I still think about those 11 seconds. Whatever happened during that time, I never saw it. And maybe that's what bothers me the most. Because people keep telling me there has to be a logical explanation. A faulty camera. A bad lock. Something with the wiring. Maybe, but none of those explanations answer one question. Why did it happen at exactly 3:12 a.m. every night? And why did the door always open from the inside? I don't know. I only know that I don't leave my apartment door unlocked anymore. I check it once, then twice, sometimes 3 times. And whenever I wake up in the middle of the night and hear a small click from the front door, I don't get out of bed. I don't check, because the last thing I want to see when I open my bedroom door is my front door standing open.